Welcome to Tales from the Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Mick West. My guest today is Jeremy Riss, who goes by the name Alien Scientist on Twitter and YouTube and on his website, alienscientist.com. And he also has a couple of other new websites in process. And we're going to talk about our kind of areas of mutual interest. I looked at his website and it's got a big section on conspiracy, and it's got a section on debunking called the Debunk Bin, and a bunch of other stuff about technology and aliens. All stuff that I'm very interested in, so I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about. So, Jeremy, welcome to Tales from the Rabbit Hole.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Mick.
So yeah, I was fascinated by your website, and of course we've kind of like chatted very briefly on Twitter about these types of things. You describe yourself as, well, your name is Alien Scientist, and that kind of, I guess, covers some of your areas of interest. Can you describe kind of how that name came about and what it really means?
Oh, well, I think I was starting, getting into a lot of this stuff back in 2002, maybe 2003,
Mm.
and started researching a lot of stuff. I was actually more interested in physics. I had started, I was a freshman in college when 9/11 happened, and that kind of opened me up to thinking about things a little bit differently after, but not right away, but years later. And I started looking at. I didn't really find Disclosure Project till probably like 2004, 2005, even though that had come out in 2001. And I dug a lot. I remember digging a lot through Disclosure Project, way back in the day, and a lot of those witnesses when that all first came out, and I had wanted to put together a website and a name to sort of embody kind of this idea, and I come up with this Alien Scientist name, and that's sort of been the channel I created, and I eventually got a website, and I'm redoing the website now, but to upgrade it and stuff because I haven't done any updates in quite a while. And you do a lot more research on these things over the years, your views sometimes change on certain
Uh,
things. So I want to talk about that a little bit. I want to talk about some of the things that we maybe agree on, some of the things that we maybe disagree on, because there's a lot of overlap, and we study a lot of things of similar interests with a different eye of skepticism
yeah.
and interest as well. Because
So I guess why don't we start with something that we agree on? In your debunk bin, you have a section on chemtrails, and you've got a variety of like, well, kind of a long page, kind of discussing like how you debunk chemtrails. What kind of led you to actually like write about that?
Well, I kept seeing it. A lot of these, I feel like it's weird because I have my own theory about a lot of these people on and how they're influenced on social media with the bots and that sort of thing. But I kept seeing a lot of this stuff reappear on my feed about chemtrails and all these other conspiracies. I remember back when Sandy Hook was a thing that was a real popular one that was going around a lot, and as well as the Boston bombing, the marathon bombing, which happened right here in Boston. And of course, I'm from Boston. I lived there for a couple of years, so I did my own investigation right here locally, like right after that had happened, and went to try to, see if I could find any kind of follow up evidence for any of the conspiracy theories. And I found that a lot of it was just made up stuff, and it was a lot of it was fake from my own investigation. And I put together a whole page on that. As well with some of
Right.
the videos that I took. I actually went to the scenes and filmed the blood on the ground where the pipe
Wow.
bombs went off in the street, documented these things right away so people couldn't say that they were made up later, or that, they didn't happen, or that, they were different. And, so I went to Watertown to, Dexter and Laurel Street where the shootout happened, and filmed, on scene to try to do some of my own investigation. And, yeah, I've done a lot of things. There's also a page on Bob Lazar there, and I've also seen you. I made a whole nother website for that, which I need to update too with all the new research and more stuff that's been coming out in the past few months on Bob Lazar, because I know you've talked about Bob Lazar
Yeah,
quite a bit,
yeah. He's
and
the guy who claims to have worked at Area 51 and have had first-hand experience of alien spaceships and handled Element 115 and a whole bunch of things that seem rather suspicious.
yes, the senior staff physicist who doesn't have a curriculum vitae. Never written any published papers that you can find anywhere.
Yeah.
Kind of curious fellow. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of interesting research we've done on him and on element 115, where the whole thing came from. I sent you a lot of stuff on that when it was first getting, it's gotten quite a bit of attention, and I'm really surprised that Joe Rogan had him on and didn't show him the same kind of questioning and skepticism that he shows a lot of his other guests on a lot of other
Yeah.
topics.
I was kind of surprised at Joe's kind of. It's almost like he's swung back into the whole UFO thing, like full bore. You know, he used to be a bit more skeptical, you know, because he used to be like a big believer in the moon hoax, that we didn't land on the moon, and then he kind of flip flopped back the other way, and he's had me on a couple of times, and I'm very skeptical. And then now he seems to be a believer of Bob Lazar, which seems a bit bizarre to me.
Right. I'm surprised that he hasn't had you back on to kind of, and then he had Sean Carroll on like a week later. After it was his next guest after Bob Lazar, and he didn't ask him a word about element 115 or any of the physics or anything about Bob Lazar, which I was also surprised about.
Well, maybe I'll get to go back on and clear things up a bit more. Although it'll probably it probably won't help that much. I think Joe's just really interested in aliens, and well, you know, obviously you're very interested in aliens. I mean, your name, Alien Scientist, it's about I guess alien technology. Would you describe it as that?
Yeah, I'd always been interested in gravity and anti-gravity and also classified spacecraft. Like Richard Feynman was the guy who got me into physics, and of course he was recruited out of MIT at like 18 to go work on a very top secret project called the Manhattan Project, which built the atomic bomb. I'm sure you're aware of it. Yeah. But it involved hundreds of thousands of people, and the government was able to keep it secret for years, and it sort of got me interested in the belief that maybe it's possible that the government has recovered stuff. This whole thing of Roswell, the whole point of Roswell that's ever always intrigued me has been the idea that there was something else recovered and there was a material switch, and that Project Mogul was of course a cover story. That's what all the conspiracy theorists sort of cling to. So my whole focus has always been the materials that these people reported. And, some of the skeptics and debunkers say, well, they didn't report those right away. It wasn't until 15 years later that people started coming out and talking. But that's also could be consistent with a cover up, too, because the people were threatened not to talk. So I try to give both sides like a benefit of the doubt, but really look for, concrete evidence. And one of the interesting things that I watched back in the day was a documentary called The Case for Anti-Gravity. And this was back in like 2000. It had to have been 2001 or 2002 that came out, maybe even in the late 90s. But at the end of it, he briefly mentions Edgar Fouché, and he was an Area 51 employee, and someone I actually later got in contact with and tried to do a lot of follow-up research with, and he was actually one of the first people that really like showed me that Bob Lazar wasn't the real deal, and that he never worked out there, and that like we went and did this whole investigation. We got all the satellite photos of S4 and Papoose Lake going back, to the Russian satellite photos going back to the 60s, and we like went through like chronologically and traced it out. Has there ever been a base built at Papoose Lake? Was there ever something there? And we've pretty clearly shown that there's never been anything out at Papoose Lake, that this whole S4 facility was based on rumors that he'd heard about a place called Site 4. And that it's really kind of crazy that all Bob Lazar gets all the attention when it comes to Area 51, but the guys like the Roadrunners and T.D. Barnes, who actually worked out there and are the real veterans, that like people don't even pay attention to those guys or really talk about them and their stories, and they have a lot more interesting things to say, I believe, than Bob about what goes on out there and the things that they can talk about.
So do you think that, so your theory here is that an alien spaceship crashed at Area 51 and the government recovered it, and they've been using the technology that they've extracted from that spaceship?
No, well, that's not my theory. That's not my theory. That's not my theory. That's the theory that goes around. And I look for evidence of that theory, and I found a lot of evidence against that theory in the scientific record of just this alone, right? I always throw this in their face, and I say, here, this would have happened, and we would have seen this happen in the 1950s, for example. This is something I point to. I say this would have happened in the 1950s had we found something at Roswell in late 1947 that caused all this. this would have been developed, and this would have like come out.
Oh,
That's
so your theory is
I,
that because technology didn't advance fast enough, then nothing was discovered back then.
I don't know. It's a good case against it. I say it's a good case
Okay.
against it. I don't say that, I try to point out that it's a good case against this sort of thing. That having, if this really did happen, we'd see more evidence of it in the record. But the thing is, I feel time and time again, I'm tracing things back to the real theory and real people, humans that worked on this stuff.
Hmm.
And I think it's almost like a disservice to the scientists to say that we got this from aliens, or that it was given to guys like Vannevar Bush at MIT, who is supposedly head of the MJ12 commission.
Okay. So, like with aliens, then, so you don't think that we've developed alien technology from Roswell? Do you think we've developed alien technology from aliens at all at some point?
I don't see the evidence for it, because I trace things back to the origins of kind of Area 51 and how it started with a guy named Edward Mills Purcell and Project Rainbow, and he won, of course, the Nobel Prize for nuclear magnetic resonance, and understood a lot about how electromagnetic waves interact with matter, and and a lot of the research that from what I've seen, a lot of the research that goes on out there is related to electronic countermeasures and electronic countermeasures, and basically how to fool radar, and how to be invisible from radar, and how to evade radar systems, and build stealth. Stealth has been like number one on a lot of their lists for years, and it has.
Hmm.
I don't believe that they've ever had a site similar to what Bob Lazar describes, where they have a hangar full of these, crashed alien spacecraft, and with all these different models and types from different star systems and
Yeah.
whatnot. I think it's a fantastic story, and one that was a great part of my childhood. But growing up, seeing this on Unsolved Mysteries back in the '90s, but it's not a part of I don't see it as a reality, because the technologies. The way the
No,
technology's developed, it would.
I saw an interview with you. I think it was at Alien Con. Uh,
Oh yeah.
you were there. I thought you said there that you thought that there was some technology that came from aliens. Is that not true?
Well, that's the idea. Is that that's what's coming out now. That's what Elizondo is alleging, and that's what these people from the To the Stars Academy are alleging, that they have material that's been recovered from aliens and stuff.
But you disagree
And
with that?
I don't know. I don't know what to believe. I'm certainly a skeptic, and I don't think that a lot of the things that they've said so far have been in
Hmm.
they don't talk enough about the science, and enough. They have these scientists on their team that should know a lot about these types of things, and they've written and published papers on a lot of really interesting topics that they used to talk about, but they don't talk about anymore. And I think that that's very interesting. There's a lot of patents and a lot of stuff coming out right now suggesting, we have some type of technology, or we cracked some type of technology that's on a higher level. And I've talked to a lot of people that believe that, there's a lot of people in the community that even have the theory that we cracked it, 50 years ago, back in the 1950s and stuff. So what I've sort of done, and the whole thing about what we were doing at Alien Con, is the launch of this Falcon space program with my friend Mark there. And what we want to do is basically create a physics lab to do experiments to see. We'll go back in time, and we've already done a lot of the Biefeld-Brown stuff, which is like the earliest. That was the 1920s to 50s and 60s. Again, what we're assuming is that they figured it out, and they had this. We can research and re-go over and relook the history of all these works, and put together a whole list of them, which we've compiled now, a long list of all the different studies that have been done into anti-gravity. And we're hoping to basically like redo them or replicate a lot of them, the ones that are within our budget, or within and we found a lot of other people and scientists and other labs that have already done a lot of these experiments themselves, and
Huh.
we're asking for their like support and help, and basically trying to rediscover this technology if it exists. And in the
So,
process of doing this, we haven't found anything yet.
right. So you're saying you're looking at all these papers where people have claimed that they've discovered some kind of anti-gravitational effect,
Well, not
and
just
you're trying
papers.
to
I'm looking at,
replicate
like,
it?
well, these are real U.S. Boeing Lockheed Martin. These are real aerospace studies that were, some cases $1 million, $500,000 studies, and there's even ongoing studies that are of particular interest that are going on with DARPA
Right.
currently, like the quantized inertia stuff. DARPA has a couple million into that right now. With
But I don't understand like why you would be doing it. I mean, what's
we want to replicate it ourselves because we don't know whether you can trust. We want to. You can't trust anything on the internet nowadays. It's kind of like the experimental method is the best way to prove to yourself or prove to everyone else that this does work or doesn't in fact work. Because there's all kinds of people claiming that this is how you do it and this is how it works. And then if we want to be like that beacon of like, well, we're going to actually try it, and if it does work, we'll report it, but if it doesn't, we'll also report it too.
So have you done any experiments yet that have produced results?
We haven't got any positive results yet in any of our experiments, but we're hoping to have some coming up that are going into a lot of the newer theories and stuff, basically.
So what do you think is the most promising avenue of technology here that you think you're going to find some results in?
I think that basically it's you're producing polaritons using a system of waves in a medium. So basically you pump this medium full of waves and you get the waves going at a high enough oscillation, and it creates these particle-antiparticle pairs called polaritons. And the whole idea is that you creating a surface around your craft and you create these polaritons around the entire surface of your craft. It polarizes the vacuum energy density and basically breaks all those quantum information loops through which breaks quantum entanglement at the boundary layer. And that breaking of quantum entanglement allows this sort of quantum slipstream effect to take place if it exists, and the math works, and the math looks like it checks out. And
is this actually something you could actually demonstrate in your lab, though?
Not without material science we have currently. We need some more advanced techniques to build these types of materials, and also a little bit more advanced radio and computer systems to sort of activate these fields and run this. We're currently looking into that and working on it, but it's been difficult.
Right. So, kind of switching gears a little bit, like UFOs and UFO encounters, like stuff like the recent videos that have been out of the Nimitz and the Go Fast and the Gimbal videos. What do you think about those? What do you think is going on there?
Well, I've been saying from the start that I think it's my take on it was that it's electronic countermeasures, what are basically in radar insertion, where they can fake false radar insertion, and they can also create false visuals. And there's a couple different ways they could do that. Drone swarms is one theory. And I know I've discussed these with guys like Gary Voorhees, who you had on your show recently, who swears, no, it couldn't have been that. I saw it on the big eyes, and I saw it through this and that. It could also have been these balloons that they released through Project Palladium, and I had mentioned some of these types of things before, and then someone came out with this article on thedrive.com that talked about Project Palladium and Project Nemesis, which were two of these projects that were they released these balloons from subs, and there's also missiles that launch from subs, which look very similar to that tic tac shaped object that goes flying across the water at high speed. So there's any number of very human explanations for these things, and I lean towards human explanations because you look at where it occurred. It's right in a bay where about 60 miles from where the U.S. Navy has a U.S. Navy SEAL training station at San Clemente Island, where they do tons of tests for the U.S. Navy. There's a couple things that were weird about the encounter. It's that the Air Force had something to do with it, and they were there on the ship to confiscate the tapes within 15 minutes, which means they were probably already on board, unless they have some kind of crazy technology that teleported them on board. Yeah. So there's lots of things that lead me towards thinking that the Air Force was running some type of drill with some technology that they have and testing it out on the Navy, this flight carrier group.
For someone whose name is Alien Scientist, you don't really seem to be that much in favor of aliens as a good hypothesis for anything. Where did the aliens come in your worldview?
Well, you look at metamaterials and also what they've done with carbon nanotubes and heat coatings for creating mirage effect. They can basically, there's any number of ways to make things invisible. And if you figured out warp drive technology, then you've surely figured out electromagnetics and frequencies and spectrums, and you can make yourself invisible. So I've always liked the Star Trek kind of approach. I know I have Star Wars in the background. It doesn't really mesh with the Star Trek, but I've always liked the Star Trek universe where the prime directive, all post-warp civilizations don't really talk to pre-warp civilizations.
So you think that if aliens exist and they're visiting us, we wouldn't see them because they would be hiding themselves?
They'd have the technology, and they, if you saw them, they'd be showing themselves to you, and it's much more likely that the things these UFOs. In fact, I've made it like I've talked to some of the best debunkers out there too, like on these UFO cases that have debunked countless of these things. That like these lights that were around Area 51 that were actually these things that are on the bighorn sheep. They're we found out they put these lights on the bighorn sheep out there so that they know that they're where they are and they can see them.
That's so funny. I haven't heard that.
And there's all there's circular containers out there, and they're actually water troughs to provide water for these herds of bighorn sheep out near Area 51 and those canyons out there and stuff. And these people saw these circular things from space and were saying they were saucers out there. So it's like there's perfectly benign explanations for some of this stuff, but you just have to do the research, and then when you find it, you can't be like, I really wanted to believe it was a saucer, though.
Yeah. So you got like a bunch of things on your debunk bin, and I see you got one page on. You got a lot on various alien things. You got a whole page on ancient aliens. And
I stopped after a point.
Yeah, Ancient Aliens, that's been going on for like 30 seasons or something now, hasn't it? It's very, very, very popular. I think it's, shows like that are kind of, in a large sense, responsible for a lot of the UFO sightings, just because people like see the Ancient Aliens show and they get to be UFO fans, and then they go out and look at the sky and they see a plane in the distance and call it a UFO. The one thing that caught my eye here was you've got Dr. Judy Wood and you've got mini nukes. And those are both two things that are 9/11 related. Like Judy Wood claims that the towers were destroyed with energy beams from space or from somewhere. And the mini nukes theory is that there were nuclear bombs placed under each of the three buildings, so three different bombs, and that's what destroyed the buildings, which is pretty ridiculous, but there seems to be a bunch of people who believe in it. And it's kind of interesting for me, like people always, there's kind of a conspiracy spectrum with fairly reasonable conspiracies at one end and completely batshit crazy conspiracies at the other end, and people draw the line somewhere along that spectrum. I noticed that you obviously you're debunking things like the mini nukes and the Judy Wood stuff. But you've also got like a page on your conspiracy section about various 9/11 related conspiracies, including like the Pullet thing for demolishing Building 7. So where do you draw the line personally on 9/11 conspiracies? What would you say is the kind of the more extreme thing along there that you think actually happened? Do you think that they were destroyed with explosives?
I think that there was very definitely some type of explosives or incendiaries in the buildings, that a minimal amount that was covered up. I thought that the first day when I watched it happen in a room full of physics students and all my physics professors, we were all like, "Oh, these buildings were blown up for sure. This momentum had to be conserved," and the way they came down so like straight really kind of was like a telltale thing for me, and it's sort of led a lot of those investigations into this. I was doing a lot of investigations early on with my a friend of the family's that I know, this guy named Jonathan Cole, who's an engineer.
Yeah, I know.
And we had put together channel called Physics and Reason. I helped him with a lot of the theories for these experiments, to do some of these experiments to really test these things, because these were the one of the pieces of evidence that particularly caught my eye was, the forensic evidence from 9/11, particularly Appendix C of the FEMA report with that steel from World Trade Center 7 that showed the eutectic formation and the sulfidation of the steel. And we were particularly curious about the official explanation for the source of that sulfur and the sulfidation, that it had come from drywall gypsum. And so we put together a theory to test that hypothesis, called the mysterious eutectic. That's the video on there on that channel. And basically, we did a bunch of experiments to try to get steel to sulfidate this way in a normal office fire, in a normal fire condition, with jet fuel and other things. And we could not reproduce the results that were observed in that Appendix C of the FEMA report, that melting and that sulfidation of the steel. And I always thought that was a lot. There was a lot of interesting characteristics that were reported from the rubble and the crime scenes from 9/11 that were consistent with the use of high temperature accelerants such as thermite. And I was always curious as to why NIST avoided doing any sort of chemical testing or evaluation in their analysis and their report. I've been interested in this whole 9/11 thing, and while this whole thermite stuff was starting to gain a lot of traction back in like 2005, 2006, is when a lot of this particular group of people, including Morgan Reynolds and James Fetzer, came out, and they got on Fox News and a bunch of other channels to kind of promote these 9/11 conspiracy theories. But they'd always mix in this hologram stuff or these no plane theories or all these more exotic and ridiculous theories. And I realized it was almost like a public brainwashing kind of effect that it had. It's like a straw man effect. It's like if we put on a bunch of fake conspiracy theories and then we debunk the crap out of them, then everyone will think this has been debunked, and no one will look into the real stuff when they see any real stuff come along, or any kind of real evidence or real information come along, which I found is...
It's like discrediting by association. You think it's like a deliberate propaganda plot to discredit genuine 9/11 investigations by putting this kind of crazier stuff? That
this group is very... can be traced back the roots of this group, and I think they're connected to a COINTELPRO operation, or a psychological operation. As I said before, I've called these people, I've said they're all connected. They all wrote. Morgan Reynolds wrote the first papers on the directed energy weapons hypothesis with Judy Wood on that space laser stuff, and it was right after they came out and wrote a bunch of other stuff. They write some stuff that seems like it's good, but then they mix it in with all this. Judy Wood did this floor by floor analysis and built this whole physics model of the collapse of the World Trade Center floor by floor, and show it and built this really nice model of the map and the calculations for how it would work. But then she came out right after that with the space laser stuff and was saying, that the cars were toasted, and all this evidence for nanoparticles of aluminum and oxide and iron oxide and aluminum weren't nanothermite, but they were created through vaporization of building materials through the space laser
dustification, I think she called it. All the iron, the steel turned to dust, which doesn't really make any sense on a kind of a molecular sense. The energy release there would be kind of large, I think.
It would be a couple. I think it was 9.6 terajoules or something. I have the numbers on my website. It's been years since I did all that stuff, but one of the best articles that came out was Kevin Ryan. He put this article out on who could have rigged the World Trade Center with explosives. Kevin Ryan of Dig Within, his blog. I think he's done some really interesting. He raises some more legitimate questions than other 9/11 researchers I've seen out there have raised, and especially there's a lot of ideological groups within the 9/11 conspiracy movement too that I feel they're trying to blame it on the group that they hate the most, and it's so it's really they're just looking at it from this one side, and then you look at that whole Karl Popper a view of skepticism. It's that we have to look for disconfirmation as well as confirmation, and too many of those people just go out and search for all the facts that confirm what they want to believe, rather than trying to find things that disconfirm it as well. And so I think it's important for skeptics to take kind of like both sides of that, not just make a
Sure,
mockery
yeah.
of everything, try to take it a little bit more seriously. And when you look into these things, because you might be overlooking something, especially with the way that I've seen all this stuff set up with the other 9/11 stuff with what I believe, Judy Wood came out with this whole space lasers thing, and she immediately started a campaign. They emailed every single physics professor from every single college. And I know because three of them that I talked to, I talked to a lot of physics professors because I talk about a lot more than, just 9/11 stuff. But three of them that know me know I talk about 9/11 stuff, sent me the Judy Wood stuff back in so they were mass emailing this material out to the community and to a lot of people.
And
And
you
I
think
think
that's the
it was done
disinformation
intentionally.
campaign?
It was done intentionally.
Yeah.
You know,
Let's just take a step back there for a second, like back to where you first saw the collapses. You said you were in a room of physics students, and the physics professor was
yeah.
there, and you knew, I don't know about everybody else in the room, that because of what you saw, that there had to be some kind of explosives being used.
Yeah.
Shouldn't that by itself be enough to make the case there was some kind of conspiracy, some kind of controlled demolition, or something else going on besides the planes in the building? Why isn't that enough to make the case?
I think it's interesting because scientifically, if you were to look at all the variables and all the little things that could have happened, with the models that NIST put forward for the collapse, it makes a lot of sense that it could have collapsed from fire the way it did. It could have. I say that it could have because if it could have in a perfect universe where everything was symmetric and everything worked out, and the laws of physics worked just right, it could have collapsed just from itself and not from explosives. And I think that's the reason that they've gotten away with it, is because you're able to kind of have this scientific level of ambiguity within a certain level of research where there's enough disbelief that people won't look into it further. I think that's the reason they've gotten
So if it could have collapsed from fire alone, then why did you immediately think that it couldn't have?
Well, you can make the case through random statistics. I mean, you can make it a case. It's exceedingly unlikely that it did the way it did, but you could statistically still make the case and still argue it. That's sort of why the skeptics still have a way out.
Right, but if you're saying there's this faint possibility it could possibly have collapsed.
This is the thing I say is if you already believe that fire, if you believe that fire alone, right, could have caused it to collapse the way it did, it's not that hard to believe that they put maybe a couple extra charges here and there in the buildings just to help it fall more symmetrically and more perfectly to get that symmetry. If you can already believe those models that it could have collapsed from fire, it's not that much of an excess to believe that there were only a couple explosives inside the buildings to bring them down. Because this thing it wasn't loaded. It didn't light up like a sparkler, and there wasn't giant pools of molten steel. There were pools of molten steel underneath the buildings, and even Leslie Robertson, one of the World Trade Center engineers, reported him. And I have a video clip of him talking about that.
I don't think he said there were pools of molten steel. He said there was some molten metal dripping down. Something that he saw underground when he was examining the subway, I believe.
Yeah, there was dripping, molten metal dripping rivers trickling steel, and
there's no way of knowing if it was steel or not. So.
Well, here's the thing too. Also, pyrocool. I remember reading this about pyrocool. Is this stuff that mixes with water to make it extra fire quenching, and it mixes with water at something like 0.04%. And the New York Fire Department ordered 500,000 gallons of that stuff, not enough to make 1,000,000 gallons. They ordered 2,000 gallons of the pyrocool mixture, and it mixes at 0.4%, which makes about 2 million gallons, I think, is what it was. And they hosed down the whole World Trade Center for a month with 2 million gallons of this special fire quenching liquid, and it still wasn't too hot. So there was some sort of extreme heat source there.
Well, that kind of suggests something more than a few well-placed explosives, though, doesn't it?
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's not that hard to believe. It's not that hard of an excess to say that there could have been some thermite in that building to bring it down. Especially when you start going into like, well, who had the access to the buildings, who designed the security systems, who are the people involved with all that and stuff, and that looks.
Those two things don't really seem to mesh there. You said that, it's quite easy to think that there were a few well-placed bits of thermite to bring down the building in a more symmetrical manner. And then you're saying there's this incredible amount of heat that took months of cooling down afterwards.
Well, that's the physical evidence. So
do you think these few well-placed explosives are going to create a huge ball of molten steel that takes months to cool down? I mean, how would that work? What's the physics there?
Well, what's the source of that molten steel? It wasn't the jet fuel?
Well, there isn't really any good evidence that there was any molten steel. No one, you didn't see any big, huge, solidified pieces of steel being carried away on trucks afterwards.
There was some pretty big meteorites that they carried out.
Yeah, but they weren't steel. I've seen those meteorites up close. I mean, they had one of them in the Memorial Museum for a while, and I've seen photographs of the other one, and it's just basically concrete. And there's bits of rebar sticking out of it which were not melted at all. So that wasn't molten metal. There isn't really any good evidence, as far as I can tell, any good physical evidence of molten metal at all, really. Certainly not molten steel. And the recollections of people seeing molten metal could be something else.
Well, they didn't do a lot of metallurgical analysis. They selectively analyzed the steel. A lot of the pictures in the FEMA report were, handpicked there, and they looked, some of that steel looked suspicious, but even the pieces that they gave were very like hand selected, the few that they did give up for analysis. And very few of these pieces have ever undergone real metallurgical analysis, and the few that did, the ones I point out in Appendix C of the FEMA report, show some pretty interesting melting and high temperature corrosion of the steel that still hasn't been explained by any experiment that I've seen.
There was a study done on that. I can't remember. It was some university. I'm thinking the University of Warwick, but that doesn't sound right to me. But it's a university begins with W. And they did the study on that, this bit of steel, and it looks like it's very, very thin, like it's been burnt away somehow. You know where it is. I'm just saying that for everybody else's benefit. And they studied it and looked at the crystallography of the steel and examined it carefully, and they said, yeah, it's probably from some kind of chemical reaction. But part of their results were they said that it would have taken several days to go through this whatever process it was. So
right.
if that was correct, if that analysis is correct, then that would mean that it would have to be something that happened in the pile and not actually in the towers. I mean, are you familiar with that study at all?
No, I'm not. I haven't seen that one, but if you do find it, please send me a link. I'll definitely check that out.
What that is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still looking for answers. I go back and forth on a lot of this stuff from time to time, but it just seems to me that if they should have had an investigation where more of these people were investigated and more of these avenues. It seems to me that crime scene was cleaned up way too fast and in way too much of in a sketchy manner of them, getting rid of so much of that steel so quickly that it's only led to more conspiracy theories. And
the thing is, though, they weren't really thinking about conspiracy theories at the time. It's not like their priority was let's clear up the conspiracy theories ahead of time. It's more like they were, let's try to rescue people who were trapped in the rubble, and then let's try to recover the bodies.
That's not true at all, because the last person pulled out of the World Trade Center alive was William Rodriguez, and he was pulled out the day after. And after that, they stopped finding bodies. So that excuse,
they were still looking for live people for a day or two afterwards, but then after that, their priority
it was pretty clear right away that there wasn't any survivors from the disaster scene.
Certainly within a day or two, I think it was fairly clear, because they didn't find anything. But the priority after that wasn't recovering live people; it was recovering bodies. Because essentially there was
No, it was not.
a
It
few
was not
thousand people there.
because they actually cleared out World Trade Center 7 first, and there was that was evacuated. So that theory is wrong
But
because World Trade
they
Center
needed
7
to
was
clear
evacuated.
that for access because it was blocking the roads because it fell on the north roads behind World Trade Center
How
7.
convenient!
Well, I'm not sure what you're suggesting there, but one of my interviews I did was with a structural engineer who worked at the World Trade Center site, and he wrote a book. I can't remember what it's called now, but it's his name is Donald Friedman, and he wrote this book on 9/11. He worked there from September the 12th, the day after, and he says in his book very clearly that the priority of everybody who was there, the firemen and the steelworkers and everybody else, was recovering remains. It wasn't clearing. He wasn't clearing things up. He was clearing things so that they could actually get the remains of the people there. And you talk to anybody who worked on the site,
It's a great cover
and
story.
that's what they say.
It's a great cover story. Is all I'm saying is that it's a great thing to tell people. It's a great motivating thing to tell people.
So you think he's
if
lying?
You're the one in charge. If you're the one in no, not them. But if you're the people like the mayor of New York, certain people that would have been in charge of those types of things and were in charge of ordering those things. It's the perfect excuse. It's something that I've looked into, quite a bit. World Trade Center 7, very interesting connections that aren't talked about there. And some of the research that I've done with the tenants list and the people that occupied the majority of those buildings. And
I know you got a lot of stuff about that.
Actually, that Donald Rumsfeld, he sat on and Dick Cheney sat on the foreign advisory board for Solomon Smith Barney, the bank that owned 85% of the floors in that building, which I thought was an interesting fact that they were so closely connected to that. They quit their positions at Solomon Smith Barney on that board just prior to taking office in the Bush administration.
I think that would kind of work both ways though, because they would they would know a lot of people who would be killed there if they worked with Solomon Smith Barney.
Well, not if anyone wasn't killed if the buildings were evacuated.
Right, I guess that's getting a bit into a deeper conspiracy. So let me just ask you, I know you have to go soon, but let me just ask you one kind of closing question here for now. How have your opinions about the 9/11 conspiracy theories changed? Are there things that you used to believe in about 9/11 conspiracies that you now no longer believe in?
Yeah, one of the early things was that pod thing, and I found a lot of evidence for I looked into the AWACS and remote controls plane systems and that systems planning corporation stuff with that remote control plane technology. I did a lot of research into that and found a lot of stuff about all the classified programs at the time that were related to that. How some of the pilots that were allegedly related to this might have been the pilots of Flight 77 actually into the Pentagon, that some of them took parts in drills of planes going into the Pentagon and some of these other weird things that have been found in the research. But yeah, I think that I don't believe the pod theory anymore. I don't think that there was a plane switch. I think that it was I think that the technology. I found more evidence that it'd be. It would just be easier for them to implant it on the augmented GPS and the autopilot guidance system. And a lot of these people have reported they get locked out. Autopilot comes on and they get locked out of the controls. And is what I think happened. It'd be easier to implement that type of system than it would be to implement a drone switch and a plane switch, and then a deboarding and getting rid of all those people that were on board the plane, or the idea that they went to work for secret government programs and they faked their deaths on 9/11 to change their identities and all these other complex theories that just require too much complexity.
But then you also think that maybe Solomon Smith Barney evacuated the buildings before the plane hit.
Well, yeah, they did. That's you try to look for. This is speculation, not you're confusing speculation on what they did with the planes with what actually happened with World Trade Center 7 as far as them evacuating the buildings. That's not speculation.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah, I was thinking. I guess I was thinking of the people who died in the towers, which was another big company That
Right, Odigo, the text message company, Odigo, that supposedly sent text messages to certain people within the towers that didn't show up to work. And there were certain interesting people that didn't show up to work at the towers that day. One of them was that guy, L. Paul Bremer, who went on MSNBC and gave us actually the first, he's the first person to finger bin Laden as a suspect for the 9/11 attacks. And he actually worked for Marshall McLennan, and his office was right where Flight 11 hit in the North Tower. And he missed work that morning and gave us the first pronouncement of the official theory. And then he later went on to become the Iraq occupation governor. So he's definitely on my list of potential suspects.
There's always lines, connections you can draw.
You know?
Yeah.
Right. Because I tried to basically look for as many connections that you can draw. Like, who are the people that involved and who got placed in important positions of power after 9/11 to do the things that 9/11 was supposedly, if it was a conspiracy, so while we could go into Iraq, we should look into those people that were placed in charge in Iraq, because they might have, and it's interesting that he has that tie to 9/11 as well.
Do you think there's ever like a temptation though, just to draw too many lines and you're just kind of making connections where they don't exist? How do you safeguard against that?
If they don't exist, then then there's nothing to this, and no one will find. But the thing is, if people start digging in and they start finding more stuff. And that's where the research goes. That's why it's all about research. Is where do the lines go, and where do they lead? Are you actually are you chasing a red herring here, or are you actually following something that's new and legit, where it's going to lead you somewhere and lead you to other things? That's a decision that everyone has to take as a researcher and as a skeptic and as a scientist, I believe. Do
you think the 9/11 research is going to go somewhere ultimately?
I don't. The thing about 9/11, right, is the people that pulled it off understood that the most important and richest and most important economic factors, oil industry and the military industrial complex, are going to be behind you, and they're going to support you, and they're never going to push for a new investigation. They're both benefited. They all benefited from 9/11. Like all the top commodities, all the biggest money makers, the oil and military industry. If you got them in your pocket, man, it doesn't matter. Like no matter how many architects and engineers sign on to a 9/11 truth, these people are never going to have an investigation, because it's at the end of the day, it's all about the money, it's all about the Benjamins, and they're raking in the dough right now. So I don't think that they're too concerned it's ever going to happen. I think this research is important for people out there on the internet to kind of want to, dig in and learn more. But I don't think it's ever going to go mainstream, because the media is too controlled and contrived. And I don't think that it's ever going to have an investigation, because the people that benefited from it have so much power. Incredible power.
Why isn't it possible, though, to make a compelling case for the 9/11 conspiracy theory? I mean, you said like with the physics thing. There's a possibility it could have collapsed, but isn't there some way where you can? You're obviously convinced, and a lot of other people are convinced. So why are you convinced by this evidence? Is it just that you are? I don't know. Your brain works in a different way. That the evidence is more accessible to you. Why can't you make a case for other scientists to believe what you believe?
I think I have made a pretty good case with the stuff that's on my website and on some of the documentaries that I put together for 9/11. I've pretty well stated the case, or the best case that I could state. And if that changes and it comes along, maybe every 3 years, I'll make a new video with a better case, maybe better, trying to dig into who could have, actually been behind it, and naming suspects, and then looking for, again, those ties that link them to those things. And I think I've made, an interesting case, and I hope that people expand upon it and do something with it. But I don't have high hopes for that, and I don't think it's as important as some of this other stuff that I'm pursuing now, which is why I've really I don't do a lot of the 9/11 research anymore, because I don't see it as a fruitful avenue. It's just like, so what? People are going to know that we did this for oil and for global hegemony and control in the Middle East, and Afghan minerals and Afghan opium, and to control the drug markets and all these other reasons. But they're not gonna they're not going to really we're not going to have free energy, and we're not going to have anti-gravity to get off this planet. And I think that those two things are more important if they exist. And to look into the technology stuff, it has been much more fruitful and much more interesting for me as far as that goes. All this warp drive stuff and debating the Nimitz encounters and TTSA coming out with this, what I think is a whole bunch of Pentagon insiders, pulling the wool over people's eyes. But I don't know. That's just where I stand on this stuff, man. And I know we disagree on certain things, and we have a different approach. But again, we're just people looking for the truth. I really am just someone looking for the truth and trying to understand more. And it makes a lot more sense to me that 9/11 was a conspiracy. According to the way that I've laid it out, it makes more sense to me. And I think the reasons for it and the reasons behind why it's not come out make sense to me. But again, I appreciate the work you do and some of the stuff that you do, although I don't agree with everything. It's good training ground because there are a lot of these bad arguments and these weaker arguments out there. And I feel like people like you have helped me sharpen the knife as far as what, I realize, going after thermite and going after explosives at the World Trade Center is not, and the physics arguments alone aren't really going to get us anywhere. And that's why I started really looking into the tenets and the connections, were there any such connections? And oh yes, in fact, there were. You look at the Rumsfeld resume and, him and Dick Cheney. They both were engaged in this continuity of government program, which I think was a core aspect. I think that's where 9/11 was planned and thought out. It's basically like a whole section of the government. It's a think tank that they basically get all these military people together and they come up with the most insane doomsday scenarios imaginable. And then they dream up how the government would react, to, multiple airplane hijackings was one of the scenarios. I'm sure the Dawson airline hijackings that had happened where 5 airlines were hijacked in 1979 and flown to Jordan on September 11th, mind you. So they had to have known about these sort of things and had to have had these think tanks. There's evidence that they have these think tanks, and there's evidence that Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld took part in a lot of those think tanks to basically dream up doomsday scenarios and come up with counter planning and that sort of thing. And I think that that's sort of like where a lot of these, if the 9/11 was a conspiracy, that's where it was birthed out on it's basically like you're basically giving them this opportunity to collect all the intelligence on something and then be able to, they had all the intelligence they needed to do 9/11 and get away with it with that kind of access to a program like that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. A lot of 9/11 people in the 9/11 community do actually kind of end up not focusing so much on the controlled demolition and whatnot, and they do move on to like things like people and the politics and things like that instead, which in a way is somewhat less tangible, even though you can name names and whatnot, but you don't know, you can't do physics, you can't do equations with people, so it's in some ways it's less tangible, but in some ways it's more accessible because you've got people's names and dates and places and things like that. But anyway, I know you probably have to go, and we have gone over an hour now. So, if people want to learn more about what you've been saying, should they go to alienscientist.com?
Yes, I'm going to be updating that soon. They can go to alienscientist.com. They can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter, and we also have that falconspace.org. I'm putting together. For the program, we're falconspace.org.
Yeah, do you want to say something about that real quick? Like what Falcon Space is about?
And also I have hoverbrothers.com. It's kind of like that was my first version of what I launched Hover Brothers back in 1998 as sort of a response to when TTSA came out and said that they were going to build a spacecraft. And they were talking about metamaterials. I said, well, metamaterials aren't even scratching the surface. You're not talking about quasicrystals or NLOs, non-linear optical materials, or any of these other they're not talking about polaritons or excitons or any of these, real condensed matter physics technologies, which are the real rage right now in the community that anyone knows. but anyways, I created like Hover Brothers first to kind of compete with them, and they said they're going to create a spacecraft, but they don't. I'm like saying I have way more science and way more stuff than you guys have been doing this, way longer. you know, I know I read all the papers of all your scientists and more, and I don't know. That's kind of like what I was coming out with that. And then Falcon Space, I teamed up recently with these other guys who have done a ton of research into Biefeld-Brown effect already, and built a lot of these thrusters and built a lot of these gizmos from other people's on the internet, copying other people's videos, and they tried a lot of stuff out already, and they sort of they reached out to me, and I linked up with them, and we're going to be doing a lot more experiments hopefully this coming year to try to figure out what it works and what doesn't, and hopefully we get somewhere.
Sounds interesting. All right, Jeremy. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming on and sharing all this stuff with me. And there's a lot of material here, so maybe we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, definitely. I enjoyed coming on, and thank you, and keep up the great work with what you're doing on the Nimitz encounters and talking to those people, because I'm enjoying the show.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jeremy. See you.
Right. Thanks.